Hello Year 12. I have had the loveliest day speaking with some of you and your parents today in the academic reviews. I hope they went well and hopefully you all feel like you're on track, and if you're a little bit behind, you know how to catch up, and you are feeling positive about where we're going next with the course. Remember to email me and Miss Sales if you have any questions about anything. Use these videos and recordings of the Zoom lessons to catch up on things that you've missed, and just ask us if you're a little bit stuck. So today's lesson we are moving on with the unit on religious language, and today we're going to learn all about symbol and how symbol can be used as a form of religious language. I am going to be pausing in a few places and asking you to read parts of the book. So we're using this book, Religious Studies for OCR, and we're going to be reading pages 54 to 57. Okay, so hopefully you've got those attached to your work today that you can use. So the title today is Symbols. And if we were in school, we would have a lovely discussion about this, and I'd love to hear all of your ideas, but I thought I'd leave this in so that you can just have a think about this for a moment. This is a great question. I love asking people this question because I think it's something most people have thought of. I don't think any of you already have tattoos. Maybe you do. But my question is, if you were to get a tattoo, what would you have? Or if you have a tattoo, why did you choose the one that you have? And I've put some pictures there of some kind of tattoos that I've seen people with that I think, you know, obviously have some kind of meaning to them. So right in the bottom there's a person who's got a puzzle piece, but they've also got like a lifeline from a heart monitoring hospital. We've got an infinity symbol, but it's also got like a little feather, birds flying, a dandelion clock, and a boat. Why do you think people may have got these symbols tattooed on them? And what would you choose if you had to get a tattoo? I'd love to hear your answers. Please send them in to me in an email. I'd love that. Okay, so it got me thinking about famous symbols, symbols that we were all aware of. And I think, without saying anything, probably all of you could tell me what this symbolizes. You could tell me what's it about, what does it mean, what's the history behind it, where did it start, how is it used today, maybe even how it makes you feel. Because I think there is so much in this. It might remind us of the history of where the symbol of the poppy came from. It might lead us to feel, you know, what do we feel about war today? I know lots of people choose not to wear one of these now, or they choose to wear one in a different colour. So I wonder, you know, what your thoughts are around the symbol, and it might be like to pause and just write down the first 20 words that come into your mind when you see this symbol. Okay, so some key terms for today's lesson are sign and symbol. So we're going to start just by looking at these as two different things. And we are going to suggest that a sign is something that points to something else. And a symbol, and you have to bear with me with this one because this is what we're going to unpack this lesson, a symbol participates in that to which it points. Okay, so this picture is not just a sign, it doesn't just point to something, but it's a little bit more than that. It goes a bit deeper, it participates in that in which it points to. Okay, so task that I'd like you to do first, please, is to read page 54, which is a little bit of an introduction in using symbols to talk about God. And then on page 55, there are two questions I'd like you to answer, question 7 and question 8 in the blue box. So question 7 says, find some examples of company logos, school badges, and other symbols that belong to organizations. So you might want to think of company logos that you've seen, or, you know, organizations that you're part of perhaps. What kind of messages are they trying to convey? Do you think the symbol is more effective than using literal words? So yeah, it'd be really good if you could like find some examples to put into your notes. to use. And then question 8 says, make a list of ways in which religious people use symbols in ways other than through spoken and written language. You may consider symbolic foods, symbolic dress, symbolic architecture, symbolic objects and artifacts, and symbolic activities. So symbols can be a lot more than just pictures. So what else can be symbolic? And try and think of some examples of how religious people, doesn't have to be Christians, but any religion, how religious people might use other things as symbols. Okay, thank you. So we're going to move on to the main scholar behind using symbol in religious language, and that is Paul Tillich. So Tillich lived 1886 to 1965, and he was a German-American theologian and philosopher. He was a Christian, and he was an existentialist. So he was looking for meaning. He was trying to find what is the meaning of life, and really reflect on that. He is kind of most famous for something called the theology of correlation, which is basically saying that everything is related to each other. So we shouldn't look at things like philosophy and art and politics and culture as all separate, but we should see that actually everything is linked, and that there are huge correlations between two of those fields. So huge correlations, for example, between art and philosophy. And he was really interested in the relationship between faith and culture, and how one affects the other and vice versa. He said that religious statements don't give literally true facts about God. So we need to rethink the way that we use religious language. And when somebody says something like, God is love or God is good, they're not kind of literally facts about God, but they are trying to convey some kind of message. So religious statements are symbolic. They provide us with some degree of understanding about God, even if that's not a literal understanding. So Tillich argues that religious language is symbolic, not literal. He said that symbols are something that we can all participate in. And the example he gives of that is a flag. We participate in the feeling of unity surrounding certain national flags. Now, again, there's a really good activity I would like to do in class with this, which is, what feelings do you get when you see a Union Jack? What does that make you think? And I think, for myself, I've got quite negative connotations of the Union Jack. It reminds me of the parts of being British that maybe we shouldn't necessarily be proud of, or ways that people have used that flag that maybe are not very positive. When I think about this flag, I feel differently. I feel because I'm Welsh, because I was born in Wales and that's where all my family are, there's some kind of strong connection for me to that flag. And I wonder if there are flags for you that you look at and actually it doesn't just make you think something, it makes you feel something. Maybe that's a feeling of unity. For me, it reminds me of going to Cardiff on a Saturday with my friends from school, going shopping. It reminds me of match days and rugby games. It reminds me of home and my family. It reminds me of walks in the Brecon Beacons. And it evokes something in me, like a strong feeling in me. And Tillich, I think, was right in using that as an example of flag. It gathers people and it makes them have a kind of shared identity in something. And so what he's saying is symbols are powerful and they're able to do certain things. And he writes about 4 things in particular that he thinks symbols are used for. He says that symbols point to something beyond themselves. So in the very simplest form, a flag points to the country that it represents. So we see that flag, pretty brilliant flag, and we think of Wales. They participate in that to which they point to. And this is the bit where it's not quite clear what Tillich means. I'm going to ask you to think about that a little bit. What does he mean by saying that a symbol participates in that to which it points to? So it's not just It's not just identifying something or pointing us in the direction of something, but it is somehow participating in that thing. He says that symbols open up levels of reality which are usually closed to us. And so that's where the religious element comes in, that there is something about using symbols to talk about God that helps us to understand God in a way that we wouldn't be able to otherwise. And finally, he says they open up dimensions of the soul. And again, perhaps it's oversimplifying it, but if you think about those feelings that are, that come up when you see a flag or you see a picture of something, it opens up a dimension of the soul, of your spirit. It makes you feel something. And so Tillich simply calls this the theory of participation, that a symbol is a lot more than just identifying something or pointing to something. It does all of this other stuff as well. So you can read a bit more about Tillich and his theory on pages 55 to 57 of the book. And I'd like you to make some notes, please, not just what I've gone through on those PowerPoint slides, but a little bit more context about who Tillich was and about his theory. And then I want you to reflect on this idea of the theory of participation. What do you think he means by saying that a symbol participates in that of which it points to? What does he mean to say that it participates in it? Okay, so obviously we could talk about lots of other religions as well, but we are using this in the context of Christianity, and Tillich was talking from a Christian point of view as well. And so I wonder if before you move on with the video, you can think of some symbols that you think of within Christianity. So you could think about pictures that you've seen of churches inside or outside. What kind of symbols or pictures do you think you've seen in churches, or I don't know, in Christianity textbooks or in the Bible? What images kind of come to mind when you think of Christianity? And because they're likely to be symbols that have been used within that religion for a long time. And do you know what any of those symbols mean? Okay, so there is one in the book of Isaiah 64 verse 8 that says that God is a potter and that people, we are the clay. So there's a symbol, there's a picture, an image that is given to represent something about what God is. What do you think that means, to say that God is a potter and that we are the clay? Quite a famous symbol in Christianity is of a shepherd, and sometimes just the shepherd's staff, which is kind of got a curl at the top. And God is called the Good Shepherd. Jesus is called the shepherd, and people are the sheep. So that imagery is used a lot in the Bible, and therefore in Christianity it's been a famous image. But it's confusing because in other parts of the Bible, Jesus is called the Lamb of God. So how can God be both the lamb, the sheep, and the shepherd? And that's why these shouldn't be taken literally. They're supposed to symbolize something. Jesus said about himself, I am the bread of life. So what symbols, what could bread symbolize? What does that mean? Of course, the cross is a symbol within Christianity. The rock, we talked about God being called the rock. A rainbow is often used in Christianity. This, I wonder if anyone knows what this is. These are the Greek letters Alpha and Omega, and that's like A to Z in Greek. So it says, there's something in the Bible that says God is the Alpha and the Omega. So it's saying God is the start and the end. Fire is used as a symbol for God. If you think about God talking to Moses through the burning bush, he talks in fire. As God leads the Israelites out of Egypt, he leads them in a pillar of fire. When the Holy Spirit comes at Pentecost, it comes as tongues of fire on people's head. So fire is used a lot to represent God, and is something that might be used as an image in churches. And a dove, often a dove with an olive branch, is a symbol of God, specifically of the Holy Spirit, and a symbol of, it's also a symbol of peace, isn't it? So all of these are images that are kind of referred to in the Bible, but have kind of been adopted within Christianity, and that you might often see as pictures to symbolize things. So have a look at some of those. You know, are there some that really stand out to you as being Christian symbols? So the cross, for example, is universally the symbol of Christianity because of the belief of Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection. Things like a rainbow, I look at a rainbow and think of pride, and probably lots of people do now. But for Christians, they see a rainbow and they think about the story of Noah's Ark, and God putting a rainbow in the sky at the end to promise to never bring a destruction like that again. And in current times, if you think about what the rainbow symbolizes, kind of since coronavirus and everything, it's been a way to say thank you to the NHS. So the thing about symbols, and we'll come to criticisms later, but the thing about symbols is that it can be a bit confusing because they mean different things to different people, and they can be interpreted in so many different ways. Okay, so the theory of participation, let's try and unpack that a little bit more. So Tillich argued that symbols help describe things that can't be expressed in words alone. So the only way we can describe God in a meaningful way is through the use of symbols. And he's coming back there to what Aquinas said about, there is nothing we can say about God that is real in human language. We can't describe God in our language. And so what Tillich is saying is that we shouldn't use language to describe God, but we should use symbols, or we can use language symbolically. So, for example, the cross is symbolic because it symbolizes God's love for humanity. It symbolizes forgiveness, worship, Jesus' sacrifice. So it can be used to convey lots of things about God, not just one thing. And Tillich said that God is the ultimate symbol, and he called him the ground of our being. So he's not necessarily saying there that God isn't real. He's saying that God himself can be used as a symbol, and that God symbolizes something about us as humans. It's confusing. Try and read a little bit more and see if you can make more sense of that. Okay, I'm going to give a little bit of a warning because although these are quite famous paintings, they might be upsetting to some people. They're quite graphic. This is an image of Christ crucified. It's quite a famous painting you've probably seen before. I want you to look at that image, and that is a symbol within Christianity. But for some Christians, it is a painting of what actually happened. So looking at something like that, for some people might make them feel something about what they believe historically happened, that Jesus was crucified. For some people, they might look at that and see a symbol of sacrificial love. Okay, so it's interesting because I think, well, when I show you the next image, I'll talk about that. But I think for some people, because that image is quite not popular, but lots of people have seen this image before, it's not as upsetting as it could be in some ways. If we were to see something like that on the news, we'd be horrified. But because this image is so famous around the world, perhaps it loses some of its, some of its value, perhaps, about what the crucifixion was. And, that was a common form of execution by the Roman Empire. But we don't necessarily look at it in that way. We look at it as a symbol of, sacrifice or salvation. Okay, the next image again is upsetting. This one is of a lamb a lamb which is being prepared to be slaughtered. Okay, and I think when I've done this in class before, for some people, this image is more upsetting than the other image. And again, I wonder if that's because we're kind of desensitized to the image of Jesus on the cross, whereas this image perhaps we don't see as often. And the reason I'm showing you this is because for Christians who believe in this, then to see an image like this is the same. It means the same thing, because they see a sacrificial lamb, and it makes them feel something about Jesus, his sacrifice on the cross, because for them they're thinking about how Jesus is called the Lamb of God, and he's called that because he's a symbol of kind of a sacrifice. And there's all sorts of things. I think I told you about kind of the Old Testament and how people slaughtered animals, they sacrificed animals as a symbol of being sorry for things they've done wrong. We talked about where the term scapegoat comes from, which is that they would put their head against the animal's head and say the thing that they'd done wrong, and believe that they were kind of symbolically, again, transferring their sin onto the animal and then getting rid of it. So although this image is upsetting, it means the same thing as this image. And so that's perhaps why the lamb could be a powerful symbol to some people. So Tillich argued that symbols can change and die out because of time and culture. So an example of that is the lamb, because you may not have known that stuff about lambs being used in sacrifices, or the scapegoat thing, and about transferring the sin. You may not have known that animals, you know, in Old Testament times were used in sacrifice, or that Jesus was called the Lamb of God. So without all of that knowledge and that context, the symbol actually doesn't mean much at all. And so the symbol is meaningful if you understand the context, but it changes over time. And so like the rainbow, you know, for me, I look at a rainbow and I think pride, or maybe at the moment I think NHS. But for a lot of people, when they see the rainbow, they think Noah's Ark. So it can change over time, and sometimes it needs to be explained, and that then it loses the value of being a symbol. Okay, so let's look at some support and some criticisms. A philosopher called J. Randall agrees with Tillich and calls religious language symbolic and non-cognitive. I think that's a word that you've used in metaethics. So it can't be proven or it can't be verified. He argues that religious language does four things. It arouses emotion and makes people act. It stimulates and inspires community action. And just with those 2 points, I want you to think of the example of this symbol. And I wonder if you know what it is. So this is the symbol for Extinction Rebellion. And I think it's a really clever, really powerful symbol. It's very simple. It has this kind of X in the middle, which kind of reminds you of the word extinction. But the X, like that, it also looks like a, what's it called? A hourglass timer, sand timer. And so it reminds you that time is running out. So I guess the circle around the edge could be about the world, the planet. It's really simple, but it conveys quite a lot of meaning. And not only that, but it's then used in a way that actually inspires and stimulates people to do something. So people will then take the symbol and they'll put it on posters and they'll put it up everywhere, or they'll, you know, with spray paint, they'll spray on buildings. And therefore it becomes a symbol, not just of, you know, isn't it sad that the planet's dying and our time is running out, but it becomes a symbol of, let's not let this happen. You know, it becomes a symbol of we all need to do something, and it becomes a form of protest. So symbols, good symbols, allow someone to express experiences non-literally. And that's the need for religious language. We talked about religious experience last term and how difficult it is for people to share those experiences, because they are kind of, by their nature, they are impossible to explain. And so a symbol can sometimes help people to explain things in a non-literal way. And in terms of religious language, a symbol can clarify somebody's experience of God. So Randall calls God an intellectual symbol. So like Tillich, he's saying, you know, God is a symbol himself. and call God a ripple of imagination. And that does sort of suggest that he's saying that God isn't real in a literal sense, but that God is kind of a construct, something that comes from our imagination, something that symbolizes something. And it's a really hard question, but I'm going to pose it to you now. Does it matter? Does it matter if, for all these people that believe in God, does it matter if God is real in a literal sense, or if actually God is a symbol of something? Does it make a difference? Okay, so some criticisms of Tillich's idea about using symbol in religious language. One comes from John Hick, who he's criticizing really Tillich's idea of participating, and I've had trouble explaining it, so perhaps he's right that it is unclear what he means by participating in that which it points to. I really have trouble saying that sentence. He actually said there's really little difference between a symbol and a sign. And if you think about some symbols that we've looked at, could we call them signs? And actually that's okay. Another critic, William Alston, argues that symbols are meaningless because we don't know whether they're true or not. So, perhaps symbols, invoke nice ideas or feelings, but it doesn't tell us if there's any truth behind them. And Paul Edwards agrees that symbols are meaningless because they can't be verified or falsified thanks to their subjective nature. And so if you think back to metaethics, hopefully you've done stuff like falsification and verification, and that is what Paul Edwards is saying there. Okay, and another critic is someone called John Macquarie, and he criticised Tillich, but not the use of symbols. So John Macquarie is an advocate for religious symbology, but he says Tillich is wrong in saying there's a difference between signs and symbols. So an example he gives us is in the phrase, clouds are a sign of rain. Well, clouds are both a sign of rain and a symbol of rain. We can't differentiate between the two. So Macquarie instead proposed an existential response, saying that symbols and signs actually link to human nature. So it's not necessarily about God, but it's about us and our experience. For example, we might use water symbolically in religion because we know that water makes us clean, and that's part of our human experience. So then we can maybe apply that to God and say that kind of we feel clean in some way because of God, or we use it symbolically as cleansing, for example, in baptism. But that's because of our human experience. It doesn't necessarily tell us anything about God. He also argued for the similarity of relation, basically the use of analogy. So there's no difference there between symbol and analogy, because shepherds look after sheep like God looks after us, and that's an analogy, and a symbol isn't necessarily anything different. Okay, I'm actually going to give you an opportunity now to either just stop there, go back through the notes that you've made. You've probably had to pause quite a lot to make notes on that bit, and that's fine. If that's taken you the hour and you're kind of happy with Tillich and symbol, that is all you need to do for the syllabus. Some of you, especially those of you who've told me you're kind of going for A's in your exam, I would recommend you stay and do the next few slides with me. This is something that used to be on the syllabus, so I'm kind of used to teaching. It's not on the syllabus anymore, but it's a good extension, and that is to look at myth. Okay, so this is John Macquarie, who is the person that was criticising Tillich and his idea about symbol. And he goes a step further than saying we should use symbols. He actually argued for the use of myths, or reading the Bible as myth in a way to understand religious language. So he said that religious language is rooted in the language of mythology, and that myths are ways of trying to explain something through the use of storytelling, and therefore a fictional story can convey an objective truth. So we could look at this. If you take religion out of it, we could look at something like a made-up story that is very common, like The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Okay, so hopefully you've all heard that story. There's a boy and he's looking after some sheep and he's a bit bored, and so he thinks this will be fun, so he runs into a village and he shouts wolf, 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 and everyone comes out to like try and help him and look after the sheep, and he just laughs because there wasn't any wolf. And then a few nights later he's bored, so he does the same thing. He goes into the village, shouts wolf, wolf, wolf. There is no wolf. Everyone's really annoyed at him. And then a few nights later, a wolf comes and tries to attack him and the sheep. So he goes into the village and shouts wolf, 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 and nobody comes out because they think he's lying. So that's a made-up story. We might call it a parable. We could call it a myth, because it conveys something that we could all say, yeah, it's objectively that's true. If you keep lying to people, then no one's going to believe you. And so we all learn something from that story, even though the story is not true, the message that it conveys is true. Okay, and so there's a lot in all cultures, there's myths, because they're used in that way, and they're used very powerfully in that way. Now, this is where it becomes problematic, because if we say, well, some religious language should be looked at as myth, then we need to decide which parts of religious scriptures are myths and which ones aren't. So I want you to just quickly think about stories that you know from the Bible that maybe we've looked at in other parts of the topic, and think about which parts of the Bible you would consider to be myths, and which parts you think Christians say are true. Okay, so the creation story, I think, is a good place to start. We actually teach creation stories in Year 7, and we often call them creation myths, because most religions have some kind of story of where the world came from. And in modern days, so now, a lot of religious people would quite happily accept that those stories are not literally true, but that they're myths. So a lot of Christians would say the story in Genesis is symbolic, it's a myth, it didn't literally happen like that, but it conveys some important truths. So, okay, God didn't create the world in 7 days, but God made the world good. God cared about the world. He took time over it. He let it evolve, but he created a world that was perfect, and he created a world that was good, and he wanted humans to look after it. And those things can still be true, even if the story isn't true. The story of Adam and Eve, a lot of people would say that is a myth. It's supposed to be read symbolically, because otherwise it's really problematic, isn't it? If there was only one man and one woman, then where did everyone else come from? You know, how many children did they have? And then is this, you know, all completely incestuous? And, you know, where did everyone come from? So a lot of people would say, well, we need to read the creation story, but also the story of Adam and Eve as a myth, that, you know, Adam represents men and Eve represents woman, and you know, there wasn't a talking snake, but that represents that bit of us that's always curious and it explores and kind of does things that we shouldn't do. There wasn't actually a tree and some fruit, but there was a choice, and that tree represents free will and human choice. The story of Noah's Ark, is that a myth or is it true? Interestingly, lots of different religions have a similar story to that. But, you know, we could look at that as symbolic of starting over, fresh starts, recreating something. Where it gets really difficult is then when you look at the New Testament stories of the life of Jesus, because Christians believe Jesus was real, Jesus was the Son of God, Jesus actually lived, actually was crucified, actually was resurrected. And actually, if they don't believe that those happen literally, then a lot of Christianity kind of falls apart. So when you look at stories like the feeding of the 5,000, many Christians today would say that was a miracle, that Jesus did something miraculous. But some people, especially if you're looking at John Macquarie's ideas, would say, well, we need to look at that as if it was a myth. And what it says is that even if we don't have very much, it could go very far. Or, you know, when we give what we have to others, then everybody in society benefits. You know, could it be that if that story isn't true, there's still some truth in it? There's other strange stories. This one's about Jacob wrestling with an angel or wrestling with God. Does that mean literally wrestling, or kind of wrestling with an idea like we do sometimes? Stories like Daniel in the lion's den. Was that a miracle? Did it really happen? Or was it a myth? So Macquarie argues that there are different types of myths in the Bible, such as creation myths, good versus evil myths, and birth myths. Durkheim argues that myths are constructs of society, not objective realities. And this is something we need to think about. The Bible was written a really long time ago. It is 66 different books. It's got many authors. It was written over different periods of time, different places in the world. And it's then being collected and put together. So in some ways we could say, well, actually these are myths that represent the society at the time, but they don't tell us anything real about God. He says that myths change as societies change, and they reflect the values of society at the time. And so we know that the creation story that's in Genesis was probably written during exile in Babylon, and there is also a Babylonian creation story that is really similar. And so maybe we can see there how two cultures have combined to create a story. So do myths have an objective truth, or are they constructs of society? The argument kind of goes both ways. Religiously, myths convey values and beliefs and give insight to human experience. In many cases, they also tell people how they should behave, and therefore set kind of societal norms. So the story of Adam and Eve sinning in the Garden of Eden reflects an idea about good and evil, but it also tells people how they should behave. Okay, so some advocates for myths are people like Jaspers, who says that myths express intuitive insights, something that you just know, such as God will take care of me. So the writers of these scriptures are actually creatively expressing something that they believe to be true. Myths are stories about God, not external realities. So the events themselves aren't necessarily real, but the reality behind them is. So again, the feeding of the 5,000, perhaps it didn't really happen, but the feeling, the reality behind it is that God is a provider. So myths carry meaning, and therefore they are still important. Rudolf Bultmann states that the Bible isn't literal and argues for the understanding of biblical stories as myths. So Bultmann says that what we need to do is demythologize stories in order to separate the truth from the myth. So what he's saying is that if we say all of the Bible is a myth, then it doesn't say, we're not saying it's not important or there's no truth in it. We're saying it's a myth and it needs to be read as a myth. So we need to demythologize it so that we can say this is a story and this is the truth behind it, and therefore we find the meaning. This way we can find true meaning in myths, and it makes religious language meaningful. So for example, Bultmann would say that the story of Jesus walking on water, that event didn't actually happen, but once you've demythologized it, it has like a really true and deep meaning, which is about helping others in difficult times. Other people, Bergson doesn't believe in myths and argues that they are defense reactions against the fear of death. However, he said that this is in a positive sense. He argues that they are a good way of dealing with death. So it's about, it's sort of what Freud would say about religion, really, that it's a way that we make ourselves feel better about stuff. And that's why we write myths. Bishop John Robinson wrote something called The Myth of God Incarnate, and he called the idea of a transcendent God a myth, and said that God only exists within people's minds. So there is not like physically a God sat on a cloud somewhere, but God exists in our minds. notice he's a bishop, he's a religious person, so he's not saying that God isn't real just because he's saying God only exists in our minds, because he's saying that's an important way to exist and it carries real meaning. And another priest, Don Cupitt, says that God is a myth, and he said that God is a construct of the mind and God is a religious ideal. So again, he's a religious person, but he's saying God doesn't literally exist, but he exists in the mind or as an ideal. So what are some strengths of looking at of religious language in this way? Macquarie argues for the existential response. So if we understand myths in relation to our existence, they become more meaningful. Durkheim argues that myths embody society's beliefs and values, and that's really important because it's the way that we pass on our values. Bergson argues that myths help us to overcome fears. Stories are meaningful and memorable. Arguably, they're an effective way of conveying a truth. So actually, yeah, Jesus taught in parables because they were memorable stories that people would be able to retell for a long time. Some weaknesses, though, of this approach, and I think these are really quite big and important, because reading the Bible as a myth is not something that most Christians would accept today. And that's partly because meanings of myths may be lost in time. So as cultures and societies change, the meaning behind the myths, what they were originally, won't stay the same. Some myths are not compatible with scientific truths, and so there's a conflict there. And this is probably the biggest one. How do we know which stories are myths and which stories are real? So if we're saying that Jesus walking on water is a myth, then does that mean that all the stories about miracles are actually myths? Does that mean that Jesus couldn't perform miracles or didn't perform miracles? What about the crucifixion? And therefore that has a massive impact on Christian belief. People interpret myths differently, and so how can they convey an objective truth if they are themselves subjective and everyone reads them differently? Some people would argue that if there is a truth to be expressed, it should be expressed directly. So if you're trying to say God is your provider, just say God is your provider. Don't tell a story about a little boy sharing his 5 loaves and 3 fishes and it feeding 5,000 people. You don't need to say that. You can just say God is a provider. Many believers do take scripture literally, especially the New Testament and the stories about Jesus, and so that's contradictory to the belief in myths. And different cultures will understand them differently. Richard Dawkins, you've got to get him in there somewhere, we'll just go a step further every time. But he argues that myths taken literally, so like things like the story of hell, are damaging. And he says that they're especially damaging to children. And he calls them, he has a term for it, which is cosmic child abuse. So reading Bible stories to children is cosmic child abuse. There we go. And that's your lesson for today. So well done if you stayed all the way to the end and you did the extension as well. So I think it's really interesting to look at reading scripture as myth and what the kind of consequences are for that, for the whole religion. That is the end of the first half of the unit on religious language, because then we're going to have a look next time at modern understandings and 21st century approaches to religious language. Thank you very much. Please email me your notes so I can see that you've done the work, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Bye-bye.